Very good evening, one and all. Welcome to the webinar, Rainbow Series webinar every Saturday that Rainbow Children's Hospital Vijayawada is doing with consultants all over the Rainbow units. So today we have a topic on dengue shock syndrome or severe dengue. Share their experience. We have none other than our very favorite colleague, Dr. Rakshay Shetty. He doesn't require any introduction. He is the pediatric intensive consultant at Bangalore. Previously, you all know that he worked in Vijayawada for 4 years. Now he is in Bangalore, and we can say he's the father of simulation. He has introduced simulation in India, and he has raised the standards of pediatric intensive care in India after when he came from Canada. So he has done his post-graduation from Chandigarh, and he went to Sick Kids Canada, where he completed his pediatric intensive care fellowship program. Now we are very lucky to have Rakshay to share his experience on dengue, and we have another dynamic young Hem Kumar. He also, you all know, he doesn't require any introduction because he has given already a lot of webinars here. So he also has a vast experience in dengue shock syndrome, including many of the complications. Who went on ECMO, he treated successfully also. So without wasting much time, before that, just two announcements. So any doubts you have, you can post in the chat box. We will directly, Rakshay will take up the questions and we will answer it. And second thing is, if from the pediatrician side, if you want any other topic to be discussed, you can post in the chat box so that next week we'll include in our webinar programs. So feel very much free to post your comments. Whichever topics you want, we can discuss here. Now I hand over proceedings to Dr. Rakshay and Dr. Hem Kumar. Over to you, Rakshay.
Thank you very much, Ram Prasad. Thanks a lot for a very kind introduction. So we are in mid of COVID-19 pandemic, and a lot of us are concerned with COVID and its consequences. But dengue has been here forever, and what we have noticed over past decade or so is it creates a havoc, and especially when it comes to children. We've faced lots of issues with the children dying because of dengue, and even during a COVID pandemic, dengue is a pertinent problem, and it's something which is worth discussing. And every year we are faced with challenges with certain dengue patients where nothing works. And the idea behind today's case discussion, or discussion rather, is to figure out how do we manage these patients more effectively. So what Dr. Hem Kumar and myself are going to do is we are going to go through a case scenario, and it is supposed to be an interactive discussion session. We would stop at certain part of the case discussion to allow for some discussion to happen. So what we would encourage you to do is, on your right hand side on the screen, the screen has various options. It has an option of questions and chat. We would request you to write down questions and your comments. So in between the case scenarios, we would stop, we would take up some of these questions, comments, and discuss around it. So what we want is to have a discussion which is relevant to you, meaningful to you, and we would summarize at the end. So with that, I just hand over to Dr. Hem Kumar to give a brief introduction and then start off with the case scenario discussion.
Hi everyone. It gives me immense pleasure to invite Dr. Rakshay sir on this platform to discuss his views on dengue shock syndrome. He is my guru, my mentor. Not what, is everything for me, and it gives me immense pleasure to share my views or to have him on this platform. Okay, first, as Rakshay sir said, it will be an interactive session. So we will run a case scenario after giving some case scenario. Then we'll give a small pause. Any views or any queries from your side, you can post on the chat box so that we can have interactive session, because everybody knows the theory about dengue shock, but there are many practical aspects where managing dengue shock children in children is a really challenging task. So we thought it would be better if it is an interactive session. So we'll go through a case scenario. A 2-year-old boy presented with 5 days history of fever, and he was febrile since 1 day, and he has pain abdomen and vomiting. He has 1 day history of abdominal distension, and he's not passed urine for the last 8 hours. And her vitals at the time of admission are febrile, and he's tachycardic with signs of poor perfusion. He's tachypneic, and his BP at admission in ER is like 69/48, and there is generalized edema. Per abdomen wise, is soft and is distended. There is evidence of ascites and hepatomegaly 4 centimeters, and it is tender. And respiratory system examination, bilateral crepitations are there, and serious examination is unremarkable, and the CN is he is drowsy. So his investigations, hemoglobin is 20 grams, and total count 5,500. Platelet count is like 79,000. Electrolytes are sodium 136, potassium 3.8, and chloride is 108. LFT slightly deranged, SGPT 58, and SGOT 169. Serum albumin is 2.5. INR is 1.9, and APTT is 65. His dengue NS1 antigen is positive, IgM is negative. So our impression is like severe dengue with hepatitis B. Now he is in ER. So how should we manage the child? As we all know, dengue is characterized by increased vascular permeability. Really, this cytokine storm, excessive release of cytokines, massive release of cytokines into the circulation makes capillary really leaky. So they'll have hypovolemic shock. Though there are no visible measurable external losses, they will be losing lot of fluid into the third space. So they'll have hypovolemic shock. This is a hallmark of dengue. So immediately on assessment in ER, we need to differentiate between dengue shock from septic shock. This is very important. Both syndromes, that is both entities, dengue shock and septic shock, are characterized by vascular increased vascular permeability. Both share common pathophysiological mechanisms. So why it is important to differentiate between dengue and septic shock? Because the fluid resuscitative strategies for dengue and septic shock are totally different, and subsequent management like initiation of inotropes strategies, our strategies initiation of inotropes are entirely different in dengue and septic shock. So immediately in ER on assessment, we should be able to differentiate dengue shock and septic shock in ER itself. So what are the common features or clinical features or lab features that helps us to differentiate between dengue shock and septic shock?
Okay, so we'll just wait for some comments and questions to pop up in the box. Meanwhile, before I think some comments come, one of the things, Haim, is what we have noticed in our practice is a delay in actual referral with the dengue fever, and oftentimes it's a common practice though that two things happen: either the patient come too late or there is a needless admission, and oftentimes it's hard to pick out and make out which patients actually become quite sick, who needs admission. Can you just share your practice about, as a pediatrician, which are those patients with dengue we should really get worried about and think about transferring, who might become potentially sick? Him, can you hear me?
Yes, sir. You are asking me.
Yeah, so I think I'm just asking you in terms of what you think are those important clinical clues to identify who becomes very sick and who should, as a practicing pediatrician, what to watch out for? Because when there's a dengue outbreak, lots of dengue patients come. To be honest, many don't need admissions. At the same time, we also see either people are too scared about low platelet counts and wanting admission to happen. And other extreme, we see patients come so late in the illness, and oftentimes we had an outbreak of dengue here, and because of the COVID scare, no one wants to come to the hospital, and unfortunately, the patients are coming at a very late stage of illness, and where it's incredibly hard to do anything. So, any thoughts on that about what, as a pediatrician, we should just focus? These are the important things to look out for and advise admission.
So most of the times, dengue in children will have milder course. That is 85 to 90% children with dengue will have milder course like fever and myalgia, some rectal pain. So most of them will be managed conservatively. They will come out without any complications. But small proportion of the children, like 10 to 15% of the children, will have stomachos and will have signs of severe dengue. So those children who present to us with WHO has clearly mentioned in which children we have to pay some attention to identify, okay, this child is going to have severe dengue. So there are some warning signs that are that have been mentioned in WHO guidelines. That is a warning signs like a child who is continuously vomiting, like with pain abdomen, and with the decreased oral intake, with outer level of consciousness like lethargy and drowsiness, and with some cool peripheries, and with clinical evidence of plasma leaks, puffy eyes, distended tummy. So these kind of children have to be paid some good attention. So as a clinician, we should keep all these signs in our mind. There is a warning signs that signals us that this particular child is going into a severe dengue phase.
Yeah, I think those are important points, and I agree with you. And oftentimes, dengue is one illness where when you become afebrile, you might land up in trouble. You know, generally during a febrile illness, you're generally safe. Of course, occasionally you might need an admission, but generally the sick ones become sick generally in the afebrile phase. And like you mentioned, I think infants who are obese, who have significant abdominal pain and vomiting, these are the ones I think you need to be very, very careful about. Very poor intake. Now, those are the ones who can actually become quite sick. And like you said, during afebrile phase, what I normally tell families is that if the child is becoming too dull, unresponsive, any swelling in the eyes or in the feet or abdominal swelling, if the hands and feet become too cold, especially when there is no fever, and the child is not passing urine for 6 to 8 hours, those children need admission. And like you said, if there are any evidence of bleeding anywhere, those children do need admission. So let's just move on to this topic, what you've said about differentiating dengue shock from septic shock. It's a problem. I mean, both of them have a very different kind of management strategy. What is your view on that?
Yes.
How do we actually differentiate between these two categories?
Yeah, there are some very important features to differentiate between septic shock and the dengue shock. As we discussed, the fluid resuscitive strategies and subsequent that our inotrope strategies are entirely different in these two entities. In septic shock, classically in dengue shock, by the time, as Sir said, by the time they present to us in severe form, most of them will be afebrile. By the time they enter into critical phase, fever is down. And if you examine the blood pressure in those children, they will be having narrow pulse pressure. So they will be losing a lot of fluid into the third space. So because of overactivation of sympathetic nervous system and severe vasoconstriction, they will be having high diastolic blood pressure and low systolic pressure that leads to narrow pulse pressure. And usually most of the dengue children will require less aggressive fluid resuscitation, and they'll require less inotropic requirement when compared to dengue shock. And if you look at the hematocrit at admission, usually they would be having high hematocrit admission. These are the very, very few important features to differentiate dengue from other types of shock, especially septic shock. So if child is afebrile and child is having signs of poor perfusion, afebrile and with high hematocrit, that will help us to differentiate it from septic shock. These are the important points I would like to enlighten.
There is one question, I think by Dr. Vivek. He asks if we can use ferritin levels to differentiate between septic shock and dengue shock.
Yeah, usually there is a elevation of ferritin levels in dengue. Thing. There are some studies which say elevation of ferritin will differentiate dengue from other acute febrile illnesses too. Like if child presents in tropical country like us, if a child presents with a fever and with a initial phases of dengue like fever, body pains, myalgias, it would be very difficult for us to differentiate from other tropical fevers. In those fevers, even if child is in febrile phase, if you send ferritin, if the non-specific elevation in the ferritin will give us some clue that child will having dengue-like dengue illness. So yeah, definitely sending having ferritin levels in hand definitely will help us to differentiate dengue from other type of acute febrile illnesses. But I don't think whether it is helpful in differentiating between dengue and septic shock.
Yeah, so I think a lot of viral illnesses we do see ferritin levels going up. I mean, for example, even the COVID-19 also, those especially who have cytokine storm seem to be having a high ferritin levels. And there are reports emerging that the ferritin levels can, higher ferritin levels, very high ferritin levels, can be associated with a more severe illness scores. And there are treatment regimens which are coming up with regards to what we should do when ferritin levels are very high. And in fact, not many people know that's something which is under active investigation. But I think using ferritin alone to differentiate from septic shock to dengue shock is not that easy, because even, for example, a septic shock can develop a very profound HLH where ferritin levels can become high. But I think like what Haim said, I mean, those are a lot of soft indicators. I mean, during an epidemic, it's reasonably quite easy to identify dengue shock compared to septic shock. But when you're not in epidemic, sometimes it can become tricky. But like, oftentimes they're afebrile, having a narrow pulse pressure. These two things generally point towards a possibility of a dengue shock. Yeah, go ahead, Haim.
Yeah. So, having said that it is a dengue hypotensive shock, what should be our fluid resuscitative strategy? What are the challenges we face usually during resuscitating a child with severe dengue? So, views from audience.
There's actually a question for you saying what is the maintenance fluid in dengue shock, which I suppose you might want to take it up later.
So I didn't hear, sir.
So there is one question which has come up from Dr. Shailendra, and he wants to know what would the maintenance fluid strategy be in dengue fever. That is something you might want to take it up later.
Yeah.
Question you asked about fluid resuscitation in severe dengue. I think it's a big challenge because dengue and fluids are like a double-edged sword. At one end of illness, you need effective circulatory volume. Because there is so much of third spacing, you need good amount of fluid volume to perfuse essential organs. At the same time, we are worried about giving too much of fluids because a lot of them who recover from this illness where they third space, they die subsequently of a fluid overload. So there seems to be we need to find a balance where we give enough but not overdo. So that's what I think I would want to say about fluid resuscitation. And over to you, Haim.
Yeah.
Go ahead with the next.
As Sir said, fluids are double-edged sword in severe dengue because though they have a lot of fluid inside the body, actual fluid that is there in the intravascular compartment is very low. So effective circulation volume is very low in severe dengue because of massive capillary leak. So whatever fluid you are going to give that is going to leak into the third space, it is not going to stay in the intravascular compartment. So giving lot of fluids in the initial phases of illness will go on accumulating in wrong place. In fact, in lungs, in abdomen, peritoneal cavity, with a lot of adverse consequences, leading on to adverse consequences with the fluid in wrong place. So it is very important to resuscitate them very effectively. So in fluid resuscitation, what is the ideal kind of fluid we need to use in resuscitation of these children, either which are better, crystalloids or colloids, because the controversy of this colloids is because the crystalloids, as you know, as we all know, that crystalloids are not going to stay in the intravascular compartment for a longer period, whereas colloids, yes, they do stay in the intravascular compartment for quite longer time. Some people use colloids in resuscitating them, so they will bring you to the picture colloids very early in the resuscitation phase. And what is the ideal rate of administration? So if you give more rapidly, so it is going to leak into the third space. So what is the ideal rate of administration? What are the therapeutic endpoints of fluid resuscitation in dengue? So these are the three questions we need to answer. So sir, should I stop or should I go ahead?
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Yeah. So there are the clear guidelines from WHO. So in compensated shock, a child presented with us with compensated shock with signs of poor perfusion with normal blood pressure, then we need to give fluids slowly, like 10 ml per kilo over 1 hour. Then after giving 10 ml per kilo over 1 hour, we need to assess the signs of that is perfusion status of the child. Then if perfusion status is improved, like peripherals are getting warm and he's started passing some amount of urine, and sensorium level is improving and hematocrit is falling down, then we need to titrate down or dial back our fluids, like next hour 5 to 7 ml per kilo, and then 3 to 5 ml per kilo, and 2 to 3 ml per kilo per hour. Then like that we need to titrate based upon clinical examination and as well as lab values, especially hematocrit. So these clinical clues and hematocrit lab values, like particularly hematocrit, will guide us in resuscitating them. And if child doesn't improve, then we need to give one more 10 ml per kilo over 1 hour, like that, 10 ml, 10 ml, 10 ml. And after each and every bolus, it is very important to assess the hemodynamic parameters after each and every bolus. So we need to see the perfusion markers after each and every boluses. If child present to us with hypotensive shock, then what is the rate of administration? 20 ml per kilo, that is isotonic crystalloids like normal saline, that is over 15 minutes. In compensated shock, we want to give it over 1 hour, but in compensated shock, the same 20 ml per kilo over 15 minutes. So after giving 15 minutes, after 15 minutes, then we need to assess the hemodynamic markers. If there is an improvement, then again dial back the fluids to 10 ml per kilo per hour over 1 hour, and then 5 to 7, 3 to 5, 2 to 3 ml per kilo per hour. Like that, we need to titrate our fluid bolus based upon the clinical markers and lab values. If there is no improvement, then we can repeat second bolus like 10 to 20 ml. This time we need to go less slowly, like less aggressively, 10 to 20 ml per kilo over half an hour to 1 hour. Then assess like that based upon clinical markers of perfusion and hematocrit. We need to titrate our fluids. So what is the best solution for the fluid resuscitation in dengue shock? Crystalloids are always better. They are the first line of agents, and they really work well, really saves life, and they're really cheap and they're readily available. So when to use 5% albumin? And WHO and CDC guidelines are clearly stating that we need to use colloid whenever there is a massive requirement for the crystalloids. So if you are given 10 ml per kilo, 10 ml per kilo, 10 ml per kilo, even without any signs of improvement, then after giving massive amount of fluids, massive amount of the crystalloids, then we should consider colloid. Like ideal colloid, like when compared to 5% albumin is safe when compared to other synthetic colloids. So 5% albumin is preferred colloid in dengue. So it is used for the crystalloid refractory shock, and it helps us in achieving therapeutic endpoints early without any fluid creep, and it helps us to avoid adverse effects of positive fluid balance. So after giving 30 ml per kilo of 30 ml per kilo over 3 hours, then still if you are struggling with hemodynamic compromise, then maybe that is the point where we should all consider giving colloid. So among all colloids, the preferred choice is 5% albumin. what are the disadvantages with the colloids? Like we said, we discussed, dengue is characterized by capillary leak. Even this albumin is going to leak into the pulmonary interstitium, and once it is leaked into the pulmonary interstitium, it drags the fluid and it causes. It is a critical concern. So we should all keep this disadvantage of with colloids in our mind. So the albumin is also going to leak into the pulmonary interstitium. It drags the fluid and it worsens the respiratory status. So this is the main disadvantage with the colloids, and moreover, it is not cost effective. So what are the therapeutic endpoints? So you have given fluids. What are the points you need to assess clinically? So it is very difficult to determine because the obvious signs of dehydrations are absent in dengue, because they're already bloated, they are fluffy, but they'll be having low effective intravascular volume. It is very difficult to determine the dehydration status in them. So they'll already have wet lungs, enlarged liver, still their intravascular volume is low. So the traditional conventional therapeutic endpoints in all types of shocks are enlarging liver and appearance of tracheals in the lung fields. They may not be applicable in resuscitating these children. So it is very difficult to determine the therapeutic endpoints, but some points are, if peripheries are getting better, if they are becoming warm and with good capillary refill time. This is very important. Widening of pulse pressure. So once we give fluids, once we replenish intravascular volume, the diastolic pressure is going to come down because of some vasodilatation. So this will lead to widening of the pulse pressure. So we can guide our fluids based upon this pulse pressure also. And this is another important thing. There's a fall in hematocrit. If there is 20% fall in the hematocrit, after excluding the possibility of hemorrhage, if there is 20% fall in the hematocrit, then that might be the good resuscitation endpoint. And this is very important. This is appearance of, and once you resuscitate them with fluids adequately, then the urine, they start passing some amount of urine. And here our target should not be complete euvolemia. So we need to restore end organ perfusion, that's all. So here we don't want complete normal blood pressure, complete normal urine input. So urine output of 0.5 to 1 ml per kilo per hour is also good enough. So here achieving complete euvolemia is very difficult in dengue because of capillary leak. So lower limit of euvolemia should be targeted. So urine output for 0.5 to 1 ml per kilo, that should be enough for adequacy of fluid resuscitation. So always we should aim for lower limit of euvolemia, unlike in septic shock where we need to ensure adequate mean arterial blood pressure for the AS. Here accept low MAP and accept lower limit of euvolemia. So accept urine output of 0.5 to 1. So it's a very, even in peripheral settings where we don't have invasive hemodynamic facilities, this urine output will provide as good guide for fluid resuscitation. So urine output and hematocrit and widening of pulse pressure, these are the three important hemodynamic parameters we need to target, we need to aim for achieving good resuscitation. So as I said, Foley's we consider as a low-tech CDP in resuscitation. It tells us perfusion status. So 0.5 appearance of 0.5 to 1 ml per kilo of urine, that signals good perfusion. And if once they start passing more than 2 ml per kilo, though it is normal for that age, it is the earliest sign of hypervolemia. That is the point where probably you should dial back your fluids. So once in early phases of resuscitation, fluid resuscitation, the child is passing urine of 2 ml per kilo, maybe that is the earliest sign of hypervolemia, where there you should dial back your fluids. That is very important. And assessing urine output is also useful to correct hypovolemia and to detect hypervolemia in very early. So if facilities are there, bedside ultrasound can be a useful tool in assessing fluid responsiveness and fluid status. So if IVC is collapsible, maybe child might require some fluids. If IVC is dilated like this, maybe that is the point where we restrain from giving fluids. So any views from your side, Raksha sir?
I think you've covered very important points. about the utility of crystalloid versus colloid. And I agree with you. I think even what we try to do is mainly 5% albumin. Now, there are people who have used 20% albumin also, but 20% of albumin, you should remember, is not a resuscitation fluid. It is to correct hypoalbuminemia. And when we are treating dengue, we are not trying to treat hypoalbuminemia, but we are trying to achieve those endpoints of resuscitation like what you just mentioned. And there are studies which have looked into use of 20% albumin in septic shock. And what they have found is very high chance of renal failure because they seep into renal tissues, cause renal swelling, and they land up with renal replacement therapy. And that can become profoundly worse even with dengue fever. So we don't use 20% albumin at all. However, 5% albumin is expensive, and there are situations where we resort to synthetic colloids. And synthetic colloids, there are quite a few available in the market. There are starch-based, there are gelatin-based, and these are the two more common ones. Now, what we use is predominantly gelatin-based because with the starch-based, there are evidences of coagulopathy which comes, and that is a big problem with dengue fever. So as much as possible, we avoid using synthetic colors because none of those synthetic colors are actually safe. 5% albumin is preferable. There was a good study which was done at Apollo Chennai, and what they looked at is using colloids to decrease the use of crystalloids. So the amount of fluid you give, they've found out a way to see whether they can decrease the amount of fluid they give to a patient. And they found that when they compared that to the WHO regimen which is shared, and when they used the colloid plus crystalloid combination, they actually administered much lesser fluid. And what we do in our unit is also pretty much on similar lines. We use a combination of crystalloid plus colloid. So there was this question about what maintenance fluid to use. So we actually run 2 IV lines, and we don't calculate maintenance fluid separately. I mean, it's a part of the entire resistivity, whether it's 4 ml per kg or 5 ml per kg. Part of it we run as DNS, which gives a dextrose content. For example, if we give 5 ml per kg, we might run 3 ml per kg as DNS and 2 ml per kg of 5% albumin. And then based upon the endpoints, and 2 endpoints like what you mentioned, we look at hematocrit. And remember, the hematocrit, what is measured is a calculated one. It's not a measured one. Actually, you need to do a Winthrop PCV to look at the exact hematocrit. So we don't get normally what is we see in the CBC report is actually calculated one. So we look at a hemoglobin drop, which kind of gives a similar information. And we look at a pulse pressure, which gives a very valuable information. Like you said, if pulse pressure widens, that means you're doing a good job. And we look at urine output. Now, urine output also is a bit tricky because as long as renal perfusion is good, it's fine. But once a renal perfusion drops, then it might not be an adequate indicator of euvolemic status. Now, with regards to the comment you mentioned about IVC, it is a useful tool, but it comes with a caveat. Now, if you have a lot of abdominal distension because of fluid, it might be tricky because oftentimes you can have a collapsed IVC. So completely collapsed IVC and completely distended IVC probably gives a useful information than looking at IVC variation. Of course, we look at other parameters, looking at the size of RV, size of LV. We also look at aortic root, aortic flow variation between inspiration and expiration to make some judgments. But nonetheless, even these ultrasound parameters are not foolproof. A lot of that is to do with the clinical decision, looking at hematocrit, looking at the perfusion. And one other thing what we also see is a lot of these dengue patients tend to have very cold peripheries, and we use back of our hand to see how the peripheries feel. And with adequate resuscitation, what we see is the periphery slowly warming up. For example, before resuscitation, if the cold peripheries were up till, let's imagine, knee joint, and with good resuscitation, you might see it going up to lower part of leg, reaching up to ankle, and slowly feet warming up. So that is also very useful parameter we see for endpoint of shock resuscitation. So like you just mentioned, at one end, we have to maintain adequate euvolemia. At the same time, we need to be mindful of avoiding hypervolemia. So that's the reason we've kind of tried to use this combination of colloid and crystalloid. So far, it has worked out well. But again, it's not a very much standard practice. There is some amount of evidence coming up with a published report coming from Apollo to say that it might be useful. But like you said, unlike in septic shock, collide is something we go a bit early in dengue. So yeah, that's what I would want to share him.
Yeah.
Please.
Okay, thank you, sir. Thank you for sharing very important points. And shall I go with the case scenario, sir? Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So this particular child, what we are referring to, the child has received 20 ml per kilo per hour of NS over 3 hours, and after 30 ml per kilo of crystallide, he received one collide 5% augment 10 ml per kilo over 1 hour, and he is monitored for endpoints of resuscitation. After 3 hours of resuscitation, the perfusion is not improved, still hypotensive, and urine output is less than 0.5 ml per kilo, and his ABC showing metabolic acidosis, and lactate has increased like 8.5. IBC caliber and TDUK is still compressed. So our impression is fluid refractory shock. What next? So in other types of shock, classically, if we take the septic shock with progressive shock, with increasing respiratory distress, with increasing respiratory, with increasing metabolic acidosis, then even pulse guidelines say we need to intubate them early. So so in this stage, at this stage, after giving 30 ml per kilo of crystallide and 10 ml per kilo of collide, here considering early intubation, what are the advantages of considering early intubation in dengue shock? So any views from audience?
Meanwhile, before they put their views, there's one question, and that's about use of inotrope support in septic shock. Are you going to cover those, or do you want to take it up now?
Yeah. Next
So
slide. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Sir, do you want to share your experience, sir, regarding early intubation in dengue shock?
Yeah. So meanwhile, before they share their experience, and question. So we are at a fluid refractory shock state, right? So you are still hypotensive. And for me, intubating patients at this stage, it's a very high risk intubation, because if you intubate anybody who is hypotensive, and if they're hypoxic on top of it, the risk of intubation is tremendous. So we call something called as physiologically challenging airway, because the physiology is so bad that attempt towards intubation can become a very high risk intubation. So this is a bit different from anatomically difficult airway, where you try to intubate but the view is difficult. Here the difficulty is not from anatomic point of view, but from physiological point of view. So what we do in our practice is avoid intubation. What we have tried in the last few years is using NIV. Now NIV also is a bit tricky. I mean, it's not a pretty straightforward thing, but what we have noticed with NIV is that it preserves spontaneous breathing, and a lot of adrenergic drive which happens with that, it maintains the hemodynamics. So the whole risk of sedating somebody to intubate, with a borderline or a very hypotensive hemodynamics, you can overcome by actually starting an IV. And one thing we need to remember though, whatever might be the mode of mechanical ventilation, whether it's NIV or whether it's invasive ventilation, a positive pressure can decrease venous return. So it can actually make things as if the child is leaking and it becomes even worse. So whenever you put on a positive pressure, you need to be mindful that the hemodynamics can become worse, BP can become worse, the need for fluid actually can go up. But that's far lesser compared to a child whom you're trying to intubate. We would definitely intubate in two contexts. Where there is pulmonary edema, you have to intubate, because you can develop pulmonary hemorrhage. Second situation would be very poor sensorium, child is seizing and completely altered sensorium, we would intubate. Otherwise, we would wait. We would give a trial of NIV, especially when it's mainly a pleural effusion, not the pulmonary edema, which is causing a problem. And that's what we would do him. I mean, what is your experience with that?
Yeah, I completely agree with you, sir, because any other types of shock, any other shock where there is a progressive shock with respiratory distress, then we would consider early intubation in those children. But like you said, this is a dengue, severe dengue with progressive shock. This is a condition where I keep this condition lost in the list, like in the DKA, like in asthma. So here, early intubation, as you said, is associated with disastrous consequences. So I would like to keep this lost in the list, because child is already hypotensive. There's the depleted intravascular volume. There on that we are imposing them on. We are imposing positive pressure ventilation. Obviously, it is going to decrease the venous return. So there is high risk of hemodynamic crash after intubation. This is a peri-intubation period is very risky for cardiorespiratory instability. So they can arrest also immediately, because the medications which we use, that is for induction, that is pre-intubation medication we use, they have high potential to cause cardiorespiratory compromise. So if you take away the respiratory drive which they have, children with dengue will have, if you take away the respiratory drive, sympathetic drive, then they'll have high risk of cardiorespiratory instability. So obviously early intubation is not advisable. It is something which we should consider lost in the list. And like in asthma and DKA patients.
Meanwhile, we would, I hope people know that you can actually ask questions and pass your comments too. So on the right hand side of the screen, you can see a chat box, you can see a question box. Please put their questions, because we can take up those questions which are relevant to you and have a discussion. So Haim, you did say that this patient is in fluid refractory state, right? So
Yes,
I mean, when a patient like the situation, the two things at least what we do is look for abdominal compartment syndrome, and second is look for bleeding, because what we have started in our unit also is that anybody who receives more than 30 ml per kg per 30 ml per kg of fluids over 2 to 3 hours, we proactively monitor their intra-abdominal pressure, because that is something we found very useful. And we do a very slow drainage of fluids if it is abdominal pressure is more than 10 and the patient is still in shock, particularly when it is associated with the low urine output. And when we started doing this, we started draining fluids quite fast. So what happened with that was, when you do that, there is an improvement in hemodynamics, but it does not sustain, because the tamponade effect of pressure is gone, and then the child again strongly seeps back into the abdomen. So what we've started doing now is, don't decrease the abdominal pressure less than 10. If it's above 10, we bring it to 10 and we just stop. And then we do it, and we do a very slow drainage, like 1 to 2 ml per kg per hour. And with that, we found that a lot of patients do quite well, and many of them whose urine output is becoming less than 1 ml per kg per hour, it just turns up. And in the past, what used to happen is urine output drops, child is still in shock, you dial up on fluids, go to 10 ml per kg per hour. And with that is clearly the abdominal hypertension becomes even worse, they develop pulmonary edema. And with this strategy, looking proactively for intra-abdominal hypertension actually work. And the other thing is we look at hematocrit and also the hemoglobin. And if your hemoglobin is normal or low in the context of refractory shock, then the index of suspicion flow bleeding becomes very high. And then we would actually think about managing the homeostasis or hemostasis in terms of either actively looking for bleeds and giving blood products in those contexts. So I wonder what your views are on this, Haim.
Yes, sir. Definitely. Child is requiring a massive amount of crystalloids and colloids, and we have given fluids, massive amount of fluids. Then definitely proactively measuring the IAP, intra-abdominal pressure, with bladder pressure monitoring is really help us to anticipate this particular complication, abdominal compartment syndrome, which can lead to cardiorespiratory deterioration. So definitely, instead of developing them, instead of waiting until they develop some tense ascitic fluid collection and then the respiratory embarrassment, and intervening at the late phases of abdominal compartment syndrome, measuring IAP proactively and intervening whenever it raises, then definitely it have a tremendous value in management of dengue shock, fluid fracture shock. So as you said, intubation in dengue, definitely early intubation is not advisable. Initial choice of respiratory support would be non-invasive ventilation only. So intubation, clear-cut indication in dengue, like if there is a cardiopulmonary arrest, pulmonary hemorrhage, and low sensorium, then definitely intubation is indicated. But we should be very mindful in choosing peri-intubation medications, particularly if we use some drugs that potentially cause hypertension, like benzodiazepines, opioids, which can take away your sympathetic drive, then too dangerous. So it is better to use something like low-dose ketamine. Even ketamine is not safe, but low-dose ketamine helps you to bring up the blood pressure. So low-dose ketamine is always advisable. So as a peri-intubation medication. And because all adverse consequences occurs during peri-intubation period, so consider the ketamine as a pre-intubation medication. And while intubating before initiation, it is better to resuscitate them adequately with the fluid, and please ensure that intravascular volume is adequate. And second thing is start inotropes on board beforehand, so that during whatever the hypotensive events that occur in intubation periods are lessened. So the role of inotropes in severe dengue. Sir, any views from your side, sir? Inotropes in severe dengue?
Yeah. So, um, so the fluid resuscitation is actually the cornerstone of dengue management. So we use fluids, but however, we look at the pulse pressure. So if the pulse pressure widens and child is still in shock, we do use noradrenaline too, because see, noradrenaline also has an advantage of being a venoconstrictor, and with that we found that sometimes the fluid requirement might actually come down. However, there are occasionally rare patients where they can have a cardiac involvement, where they can have myocardial dysfunction as a part of dengue. So we use adrenaline in them, but otherwise, I think uh, we generally don't use it as a first go part of resuscitation. We use once we feel that we have resuscitated them adequately, and then the fluid requirement is not coming down, then we add a bit of noradrenaline to see whether we can actually come down on the fluid rate. And also, we use that quite a bit around the peri-intubation period. So like what you mentioned, so if you land up intubating, then to tide over the crisis of hypotension during intubation, you need to use vasopressor support. Yeah.
Okay, great. So many of the times, management of dengue shock is fluid resuscitation. The mainstay of treatment, the crux of the treatment is like fluid resuscitation. Usually, children with dengue, moderate or severe dengue, they hardly require any inotropes, because some proportion of the children with dengue will have underlying myocardial dysfunction in them with with bedside ultrasound assessment of cardiac function. If cardiac function is very low, and if it is also with myocardial dysfunction, yes, definitely inotropes have some role. If child has hypertension, adrenaline is drug of choice. If child is normotensive, maybe we can start dobutamine. These are the choice of agents of vasoactive agents. So in septic shock, this is the one of the important key distinguishing feature from septic shock. In septic shock, we consider inotropes once it is fluid refractory. But in dengue, if it is fluid refractory, then we'll think of other causes. Like important cause is occult blood loss. So one of the major cause for fluid refractory shock is ongoing occult blood losses. Blood loss may not be usable. They might have blood into the gut, and to appear down, it might take some time. So this is concealed hemorrhages. We need to consider most important as a most important cause for fluid refractory shock. So what are the management strategies of bleeding in severe dengue? It is really challenging task to manage bleeds, severe bleeds in children with dengue. So what are your unit policies, sir, Akshay sir, in management of bleeding in severe dengue?
Yeah, so I think it's a very important question. So there are two aspects to this bleeding in dengue shock. One is the low platelet count alone does not cause bleeding. It's important to understand. Even if platelet drops to 10,000, we don't give platelets in our unit. Low platelet count alone does not cause bleeding. You know, there are whole set of people with chronic ITP who survive entire adulthood with a very low platelet count. So it's important to know that Low platelet count alone is not harmful. So what causes bleeding? So generally we say vicious triad, a triad of coagulopathy. That means you have acute liver failure. You have an INR which is prolonged along with the low platelet count. You have acidosis. Okay, so patient is in shock and you have acidosis. And third is hypothermia. Presence of low body temperature, it makes you coagulopathic. So combination of these three, when it is there, then you tend to bleed. So what we have done over years is identify this pattern. So a patient who comes to ICU has acute liver dysfunction, has INR which is prolonged, is hypothermic, blood gas is showing acidosis. We know that this is a very, very high risk patient to bleed. So the first step, according to me, is how do we ensure that they don't bleed? Okay, so preventing bleeding. Now, preventing bleeding is a very important step. So in these particular patient groups, if you try to even place an NG, they can bleed profoundly from oronasal cavity, from adenoids, from tonsils, and then it becomes a nightmare. And then that bleeding, we try to give blood, and then you'll end up with fluid overload. So avoid any kind of invasive procedure. At the best, if you need, you place an oronasal tube. In infants, we've found that a lot of efforts to get a peripheral line, and they seep blood even through peripheral line into subcutaneous tissues and land up with a tremendous drop in hemoglobin. Trying to place central lines, they can actually, even though we have placed first prick, they can bleed from subcutaneous areas, and then that can cause profound problems. So avoid as much procedures as possible. So this is the reason when patients get admitted and when they're high risk patients, we try to get a PICC line well in advance when the platelet counts are normal, child is not coagulopathic, because that's the least chance of you bleeding. But when you're already in shock, you're acidotic, when you are hypothermic and you're coagulopathic, you try to get arterial line, peripheral line, two central lines, central line, two peripheral lines, placing an NG, placing an OG, everything can tremendously increase chance of bleeding. But there are situations when patients do come, they come referred that at that point in time. So then what we assume is any procedure is going to cause bleeding no matter how well you do it. So we kind of follow the policy which is mentioned for trauma. So we would assume that, okay, this patient is likely going to bleed, and whatever I'm going to do, this patient is going to have profound bleeding. So any patient who's acidotic, shock, who is coagulopathic, as well as having hypothermia, we'd assume that any procedure would make them bleed. So we would kind of activate massive transfusion protocol in them. So we would get a unit of packed, the whole blood, if you can get, that's the best. But oftentimes our blood banks, they don't give us whole blood. So we take platelets, FFP, and blood, and then we follow a massive transfusion protocol for these patients because they tend to bleed. At the same time, we also it is important to correct each of those. So correcting acidosis, correcting hypothermia, very, very important, because hypothermia is something which is grossly missed. So we have a body warmer in our unit, so we ensure that the body is actually warmed up to normal temperature. Another important thing which should not be missed in a bleeding patient is hypocalcemia. Calcium is a very, very important part of coagulation pathway, and hypocalcemia can make things significantly worse. So we try to correct calcium too. So this is our approach here about how do we go about managing a patient's bleeding.
Yeah. Thank you, sir. Thank you. And here, as Rakesh sir has mentioned, here the bleeding in severe dengue is not because of thrombocytopenia alone. That should be kept in your mind. So the bleeding here, we have major reaction. Once we see low platelet count, that is thrombocytopenia of 50 or 60,000, we end up in giving platelet transfusion to them, and it will cause positive fluid balance, fluid overload consequences, all we see in dengue children. So it is very important to remember that bleeding in dengue is not because of thrombocytopenia alone. Here it is the deranged coagulopathy that causes bleeding. In my view, that is uncorrected prolonged shock is the cause of bleeding. So if you give fluids at right time, if you resuscitate them correctly, adequately, then definitely they're not going to end up with coagulopathy. This is my view. So the prolonged uncorrected shock will lead to coagulopathy. And as sir said, there is a lethal triad: hypothermia, acidosis, and bleeding. So this is the lethal triad we should anticipate, and we should prevent that happening. So So we need to anticipate this lethal trait, that is hypothermia and bleeding and acidosis. And here we, in our unit, we policy like most of the times we use, as Sir said, we avoid putting central lines, we avoid any other invasive procedures. So if at all, if some nurse has enthusiastically put NG tube and child is bleeding like nasopharyngally, we follow local hemostatic measures like putting Foley's and causing some tamponade effect over the local area, so that the bleeding will stop. Instead of giving them blood products, a lot of blood products, and facing the adverse consequences of fluid overload, it is better always to follow local hemostatic measures like putting some Foley's and having a tamponade effect and stopping the bleed. And if some sister has put some line, arterial line or central venous line, then if it is bleeding from the central line, just applying some compressions over that will lead to decrease in requirement of blood products. And that is the one of the most important measures, that is avoiding bruises as much as possible and following the local hemostatic measures. And second thing is, dengue, apart from deranged coagulopathy, it is characterized by fibrinolysis. So antifibrinolytic agent like tranexamic acid, uses of this tranexamic acid can arrest bleeding in severe dengue patients. So following local hemostatic measures and avoiding bruises, using Tranexa as a effective hemostatic measure, and as Sir mentioned, there is a, instead of giving individual blood components, like if child has a prolonged INR, give FFP. If child is having anemia, giving PRBC, and if child is having thrombocytopenia, giving them platelets. Instead of giving individual blood components, it is always preferable to give fresh whole blood. It will result in correction of coagulopathy because it contains a lot of anticoagulants in that. So correction of coagulopathy, and it can have the effect of plasma expansion, and it can correct your shock. So it will serve all purpose, like correcting anemia, thrombocytopenia, and coagulopathy. So it is always better to use fresh whole blood if it is available, because already stored blood already they'll aggravate the hypothermia. So giving warm fresh whole blood is equal to giving 10 units of platelet concentration. So always fresh whole blood is preferred when compared to blood individual blood component therapy. This is our unit policies.
Yeah, so those are good, Him. So there are a couple of questions which have come up here. I think about one is about role of tranexamic acid. Do we use that is one question. And there's also a question about draining pleural fluid, because I think from Dr. Tushar Agarwal, he says there is a severe dengue with massive pleural effusion, quite leaky, on BiPAP, increased work of breathing, tachypnea is very high, platelet count is 12,000, should it be drained? But there's a risk of bleeding. What should we do? Any thoughts on these two things?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. If there is a massive pleural effusion with respiratory embarrassment, definitely draining of pleural fluid is advisable. But here the draining of fluid is, if you drain it all of a sudden, if you drain all the fluid from the pleural cavity, then it can lead to some disastrous consequences. So slow drainage of the pleural fluid is definitely, it's not more than 10 ml per kilo. So definitely advisable. And thinking of the bleeding risk, that is thrombocytopenia, as we discussed, thrombocytopenia alone will not cause bleeding, severe bleeding. So if there is a deranged coagulopathy, transfusing them with threshold blood or FFP, then probably we should attempt draining the pleural fluid, but not more than 10 ml per kilo, because it can lead to pulmonary edema. Sudden drainage of pleural fluid from the cavity will lead to pulmonary edema.
Yeah, there can be re-expansion pulmonary edema, like what you mentioned. So, I mean, we use a lot of ultrasound for all these procedures, whether we are playing a peritoneal drain or a pleural drain, like what Dr. Hay mentioned, because it does increase the chance of bleeding. So we take that kind of precaution, and then you should assume that this patient can bleed. So you need to prepare yourself with the necessary blood products. And oftentimes, if the platelet counts are too low and patient is coagulopathic, we want to keep platelet counts around 50,000. So we run under STP cover. But if the patient is having significant, the requirement to drain pleural fluid, it's quite, it's not, we drain more of abdominal fluids than pleural fluid, primarily for the reason of abdominal compartment syndrome and poor renal perfusion. But there are occasions where you think the work of breathing is too much, you might want to drain, but that's something, you know, not done that often. I mean, done occasionally, but again, done under ultrasound guidance with the precautions what Hay mentioned. So there are a couple of other questions. I think Dr. Milind has asked some questions. He says, what blood products do you use if hematocrit is low? And I think you kind of covered it. I mean, whole blood product is something we use, but if that's not there, then you use a combination of FFP, packed RBCs, and platelets. There is one question by Dr. Ashwini. He wants to know about the role of Lasix, and also the similar line of Lasix. Dr. Balakrishna has asked a question: can you use albumin plus Lasix in the presence of fluid overload plus oliguria? Do you want to take up these questions, him?
Yes, definitely. In phase of critical phase of illness, like if there's still if child is in shock, then combining the Lasix is a bit dangerous. So it can deplete the intravascular volume. Definitely is in a deresuscitation phase. Once shock is reversed and you are saying all signs of fluid overload, then probably that stage we can give Lasix. But combined Lasix definitely would need some amount of albumin for tubular transport. But once shock is reversed, only Lasix alone can will make them diurize.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, completely agree. And I think in an active leaking phase, we don't use Lasix, because what happens with Lasix is that you have no control about how much fluid goes out. At one end you're leaking, other end you're giving Lasix. It kind of becomes very difficult to achieve fluid control. And like what Hay mentioned, I mean, once the leaking has stopped and your issue is a fluid overload, we do use albumin Lasix, but definitely not during active leaking phase. And that's a transition which is not that easy to identify, needs some experience. So we would use ultrasound markers like looking at IVC. If IVC is completely full now, patient's platelet counts are recovering, pulse is becoming wide, hemodynamics is better, and now it's no longer leaking, which is the issue. It's a fluid overload. We do use albumin Lasix in those particular contexts. Dr. Milind also has one question about when do you actually give platelets in dengue fever? And also, I think Dr. Shailendra has asked a very interesting question. If a patient is overweight and obese, which weight will you consider for fluid overload? And also, he wants to know, yeah, what weight? Do you take dry weight or do you take the current weight?
So ideal body weight.
Okay, ideal body weight. Okay, I think that sounds kind of a reasonable answer. And also, there are a couple of questions on steroids in dengue, which I think you might want to take up during the course of your case scenario. And do you want to take up this question about, is there a role actually to give platelets at any point in time?
So actually guidelines says less than 20,000 with active bleeding, or less than 10,000 with or without active bleeding, that what WHO guidelines mentioned.
And also there's one question again by Dr. Shailendra Yeluri, and I want to know if there is any role for acetylcysteine, N-acetylcysteine in dengue hepatitis.
So there is no role, but still in hepatic failure we do use N-acetylcysteine infusion because it has have some antioxidant effect, but no studies on N-acetylcysteine which have proven the effect of it. There are no such studies in acute hepatic, that is fulminant hepatic failure secondary to dengue.
Yeah, I think if you ask people about their practice, I mean, based on the experience with other acute liver failure, even non-paracetamol liver failure, people do use acetaminophen, 100 mg per kg per day till the liver functions get better, or up till 10 days. So similar kind of things are used in dengue fever too. But like what Hay mentioned, there is no high quality evidence to say that it actually makes a difference. Okay. So let's just finish the case scenario. Yeah, I think we are almost, I think 9:15. So might we can just finish off your scenario. And I think at the end of scenario, we'll take up a couple of questions and then wind it up. Okay.
Yes, sir. Right, sir. Okay. So, as already we discussed, when to suspect hemorrhage in dengue. So, if there is a refractory shock, even with normal hematocrit or low hematocrit. So, refractory shock, if it is because of capillary leak, the hematocrit should, we expect hematocrit should be somewhere high. So here, if child is child is having refractory shock with normal hematocrit or low hematocrit, then this is the point where we should suspect some occult blood loss. If there is persistent metabolic acidosis, despite of massive amount of fluids, if there is a persistent metabolic acidosis, then we have to suspect shock, because we might be giving free RBC containing fluids that will not correct shock unless you give PRBC transfusion. So persistent high lactates, and if there is a severe abdominal pain, as I said, if there is a bleeding ongoing inside the gut, so the concealed hemorrhage can cause severe abdominal pain. So suspect if the child is having, apart from the tender hepatomegaly, the cause of abdominal pain, if the concealed hemorrhage into the gut can also cause severe abdominal pain, so we need to suspect. And if child is lethargic and restless despite receiving massive amount of fluids, then this is the scenarios where we have to suspect hemorrhage and think about the blood loss and transfuse with whole blood instead of giving them individual blood component. So, and even after refractory shock, even after fluid and blood, then we need to suspect myocardial dysfunction, as I mentioned already, by bedside 2D echo, assess the cardiac contractility. Cardiac contractility is low, and if child is hypotensive, start them on adrenaline. And if child is normotensive with compromised cardiac contractility, maybe dopamine and melatonin are the good choice. So, as I mentioned, we need to think the abdominal compartment syndrome as an important cause of refractory shock. So, compartment syndromes in dengue. So, abdominal compartment syndrome identification. There was a still refractory shock, signs of pleural perfusion with abrupt drop in hemodynamic pressure, because the massive tense fluid collections in the peritoneal cavity will compress the IVC and will compromise the renal perfusion and will give it to abrupt drop in the urine output and tense and rigid feel abdomen. So this is the late sign, because if child is already receiving massive amount of fluids, then we need to anticipate abdominal compartment syndrome. We need to proactively measure IAP, that is intra-abdominal pressure, and document intra-abdominal hypertension. The surrogate marker to measure intra-abdominal pressure is bladder pressure. So once we identify this, if intra-abdominal pressure is more than 20 with organ function, or if it is more than 12, then we say it as intra-abdominal hypertension. So the treatment of choice is Parkinson's drainage of the fluid. Here we need to drain it very, very slowly. So sudden drainage of the fluid from the peritoneal cavity may lead to better hemodynamics, but it is a transient phenomenon. So the drainage of the fluid from the peritoneal cavity should be very gradual and gentle. So this is how we measure the bladder pressure. After 72 hours, coming back to the case scenario, after 72 hours, shock has dissolved, the good blood pressure, bounding pulses, you do not put more than 3 cc per kilo, sensorium improved, but there is a deterioration in the respiratory status. HL is continues to be tachypneic, requiring high oxygen support, SpO2 to 98% even on NRM. Lungs, if you ask lungs, bilateral crepitations are there, and this is the ABC. So with resolving shock with deterioration of respiratory support, this is the X-ray. So we need to have pulmonary edema as a diagnosis, the pulmonary edema during re-entry phase. So after 72 hours, once shock is resolved and respiratory status is deteriorating, we need to think of this possible complication like pulmonary edema. So the treatment of choice could be like restricting the fluids and fluid removal with the diuretics. If child is diuretic resistant, then use peritoneal dialysis or SLED to remove the excess amount of the fluid. So once after 7 days, then again into the 7th day of illness, clinical deterioration has started in form of persistent fever spikes, decreasing alertness, and reduced feeding, worsening ascites, and peripheral edema, and abdomen. If you palpate, then there is splenomegaly. So the clinical course hemoglobin is, there is pancytopenia, hemoglobin 6.5, platelets are 45,000, total count is 2,400 with the deranged liver functions, and PT ability is more than 70, and albumin is 1.6, CRP is 41, electrolytes, these are the electrolytes with some degree of hyponatremia, urine protein creatinine ratio is 2.28. What is happening with the child? So with this clinical course, we need to suspect if there is any secondary sepsis or secondary HLS. So the diagnosis of secondary HLS is we need to send HLS profile like ferritin and fibrinogen triglycerides and markedly reduced NK cell function and increased soluble IL-2 receptors, and bone aspiration shows evidence of hemophagocytosis. That will establish our diagnosis. The treatment of HLH is only three, that is methylprednisolone or IVIG with or without plasma exchange. In severe form of, we may have to do plasma exchange always. But it is very important to think of HLH if there is persistent fever spikes and biocytopenia in recovery phase of dengue. So because of the prompt diagnosis and treatment will have better prognosis. With steroids, it do respond very well. So it is very important for any clinician to have this diagnosis in mind if a child with severe dengue is having persistent fever spikes in biocytopenia with elevated ferritin, triglycerides, and low fibrinogen. And therapeutic approaches for sepsis and secondary HLH are different, because the primary HLH usually we treat them with more cytotoxic drugs, but secondary HLH drugs will require less cytotoxic drugs. Even the steroids will do a great job. So it is very important to keep this diagnosis in mind. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much, Hem. I think there are quite a few questions which we'll try to take up. I think Dr. Vivek has asked a couple of questions.
Rakshay, one second, Rakshay. Yeah, before taking that questions, yeah, there's a phenomenal response for your webinar today. Total 225 attendees are there. That's a great response, Rakshay. Congratulations, both of you. Second thing, next week we are having next Saturday webinar on approach to a bleeding neonate, and of course ITP by Dr. Srisha Rani, and approach to bleeding neonate by Vijay Kumar, our neonatologist. Yeah, continue, Rakshay, please continue.
So there's a couple of questions, one by Dr. Vivek. He asks if INR is more than 1.5, APTT is more than 1.5 times, platelet is less than 50,000, transaminitis with melena with no other obvious bleed, and a stable hematocrit on IV fluid of 3 ml per kg. Does this need an FFP transfusion, or alone vitamin K is sufficient? And what is the role for tranexamic acid? And actually, there are a couple of questions on when to use FFP in dengue.
See, we should not taken away by that INR value. So we should not treat the number. We should treat the patient clinically. So here the INR would indicate us only one side of the arm. So it will only indicate the prothrombotic state. In children with hepatic failure secondary to dengue, both prothrombotic factors and antithrombotic factors are not synthesized very well. So we are measuring only that is anticoagulant part, but we are not measuring the prothrombotic part. So looking at the INR alone would not drive us towards giving them FFP transfusion. So we should not treat the number. If child is clinically stable, I think we should keep close watch on evidence of clinical bleeds, and following INR would be suggested.
Yeah, and I think the role mainly comes, especially if you're doing a procedure with all the precautions what Dr. Hem mentioned. And also I think Dr. Vivek had asked a question about a child with COVID-19 plus dengue fever and ferritin levels are high. Can we use steroids? And also there's a couple of questions about role of steroids in dengue fever. Any thoughts on that, Hem?
So as such, there is no role of dengue, no role of steroids in dengue unless child is having secondary HLH. With a severe cytokine storm that is reflected on ferritin value, that is high ferritin values with biocytopenias, with organomegaly and persistent fever spike. In that phase, I would consider giving them steroids, but in reversal of shock or in other phase, in the other stages of organ dysfunction secondary to dengue, there is no role of steroids.
I think there are specific indications for steroids, what he mentioned, but those are to control dysregulated immune response. So what we have noticed in our practice is, this is Dr. Joe Carcillo has described in sepsis. There are 3 types of phenotypes of shock, septic shock, what people have identified. One, where there is immunosuppression. The WBC count is very low, it doesn't recover much. And these patients tend to have persistent fever and recurrent infection. So this is something we've seen in dengue fever too. WBC count stays low. Fever just does not stop, or they develop a blood culture which is positive, or a urine culture which is positive, or they go home again, come back within one more infection within a week or 2 weeks of discharge. So these are particular patient groups which you have immunosuppression. The second patient group who tend to have HLH-like picture. So they have either very high ferritin levels, they have a macrophage activation syndrome, and definitely IVIG or steroids. So are beneficial in this patient group, whether they are COVID-19 or whether they're dengue. The pathophysiology is almost quite similarly same. And many times we try to use IVIG if it is feasible, because the coexistent bacterial infection is not very easy to differentiate. And many times when you do even procalcitonin level, they tend to be very high. And we have noticed that with COVID-19 too, that just inflammation of the bacterial sepsis can give a high procalcitonin level. So if patient can afford, we give IVIG. If not, steroids are definitely indicated in those patients who have very high ferritin levels, who are having progressive organ dysfunction or evidence of HLH. Steroids can be given. A third patient group which we found very difficult and outcomes are generally quite poor is a new onset hepatobiliary dysfunction. Either they have permanent hepatic failure or they develop obstructive jaundice plus ARDS, and they tend to do quite badly. And there is some literature to suggest that anakinra might be beneficial, IVIG can be beneficial in these patient groups, but these are ones which are really difficult to treat, and where all the role of FFP comes, plasmapheresis might come, steroid might come. So very specific patient groups where you might want to consider. There are a couple of lot of questions around steroids, which I think we have answered, and there are also questions about role of Lasix, which I think we told. I think what is really important to know is be very careful when you use Lasix. Do not use Lasix during an acute leaking phase. And how do you know leaking is stopped? I think Dr. Nayan has asked that question. So I think we've kind of discussed that. You would look into parameters about resolution of shock in terms of pulse pressure becoming wide, peripherals becoming wide, capillary fill time is normal, platelet count is actually kind of getting better, pulse pressure is getting wide, and then you see your IVC is kind of getting full. So these are the patient groups you know that leaking has kind of stopped. And when you have you're decreasing the fluid rate, but your hematocrit is actually not increasing, kind of stabilized hematocrit, that kind of gives a reasonable indication to say, yes, there is no more leaking. In those specific patient groups, you might want to consider Lasix, provided you think the patient is needing some kind of oxygen or respiratory support to speedify. Otherwise, patients oftentimes have a profound diuresis and they would do well. And I think Dr. Nayan also has asked one question about when do you actually think about starting renal replacement therapy? So, and how to understand leaking phase has actually stopped, which I think we kind of answered. Ideal time to start RRT is very difficult question. Let's take an example where more simpler situation where patient has passed through a leaking phase, gone into fluid overload, but during leaking phase child has developed renal failure. Is not able to pass a diuresis. Patient heart looks completely full, IVC looks quite full, hematocrit is actually dropping, not actually increasing. Patient is developing pulmonary edema, so definitely is a good indication to start renal replacement therapy. Now, I think Haim did cover about what renal replacement therapy to use. Peritoneal dialysis is a very difficult modality, and there's a study which was done in Sri Lanka, and they saw that all the patients who developed peritoneal dialysis, who needed peritoneal dialysis, they died. So it's especially leaking phase, your whole hemodynamics goes for a toss, because at one end you are giving fluid, causing intermittent hypertension, second you're opening. So it's a very difficult modality to use. CRRT is a mode to use in leaking phase if you land up using. Very specific indications during leaking phase to use. You would use if a patient is in severe acidosis and you need to give a lot of blood products because patient is now bleeding, and you're worried that you are going to use blood products much more than needed for hemodynamics, then you have to go to CRRT, where you want to give blood products to get hemostasis. At the same time, remove extra fluids you're given through as an ultrafiltrate. So that's a condition you might want to use, or you've developed a severe acidosis, and you might want to use other regimens like plasmapheresis or sometimes even cytosol. These are very specific indications, not something which is used regularly. But otherwise, classic indication is to use during the reabsorption phase. Sorry. So there's one question also about how do you drain the abdomen. I think we covered it. So you would not cover two things we see while draining fluid through abdomen. One, abdominal pressure, We don't allow abdominal pressure to fall less than 10. So we control drainage, and we would drain somewhere around 1 to 2 ml per kg per hour. It's a quite slow drainage. So yeah, so I think we've kind of fairly covered lots of questions which I've asked. And I think there is one question by Balakrishna. He says he had a case with hemophilia plus dengue. What is the role of cryoprecipitate in such condition, and can we follow massive transfusion protocol if cryoprecipitate or specific factor is not available? Any thoughts on that, Him?
So very difficult to mention, sir.
Yeah, I think the factor 7 would be a very important modality to use. Of course, if you don't have factor 7, then you would use cryoprecipitate to manage this child. But I think factor 7 is something people have tried to use in profound bleeding in dengue. But I think classical indication to use would be hemophilia. And I think we've kind of covered most of the questions which have been asked, and it's been a very engaging participant asking a lot of questions and very good presentation, him. And I think it was wonderful interacting with him. And I hear you do wonderful work at Vijayawada, and a lot of sick dengues have been saved at Vijayawada Pediatric ICU, which is not a small feat, because the particular case what you presented is one of the real difficult cases to give a good survival. So congratulations to you, Ram Prasad, and the entire team for the fantastic work you do at Rainbow PSU. And thank you so much for involving me in this discussion. And it is felt like being a part of family. Spent quite some meaningful years at Vijayawada and made a lot of friends there. And it was one of the wonderful times I had was actually spending time at Rainbow Vijayawada. So thank you so much for calling me, and thank you very much for making me part of this wonderful discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Rakshay. We will be again troubling you for every pediatric intensive care traffic. We might be troubling you. We are not going to leave you very, like that. Okay. Please accept our invitation whenever we are inviting you.
Anytime.
Yeah. Thank you very much for your. Though now time is now 9:30, still we have a lot of attendees waiting and hearing for this one. So thank you very much. Thank you, Hem. Thank you, Rakshay, for your excellent presentation. Thank you all pediatricians who have attended this program. So as I said, you can select your topics and you can post here so that we can choose these topics in our next webinars also. So thank you very much. Signing off from here. Thank you. Thank you one and all.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.